Welcome to the Feisty Women's Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Gross, Ironman champion, PhD in women's history, and founder and CEO of Feisty Media. I started this show because I wanted to cut through the BS of diet culture and fitness culture and actually learn from high-achieving women at the top of their game who have figured out how to feel and perform their best at every stage of life. So I chat with experts, elite athletes, and leaders who have learned to succeed despite the massive gender data gap in exercise and medical science and product development. Every episode is filled with information, advice, and anecdotes that will help you fulfill your potential as an athlete, mom, leader, or business owner. And listen up. If you don't subscribe to our Women's Performance newsletter, you are definitely missing out. It's totally free. So head over to womensperformance.com and subscribe now. That's womensperformance.com. This podcast is a production of Feisty Media. Hi, Feisties. I hope everyone's having a great day. I have an amazing interview lined up today. But first, I just want to tell you, I don't know if it's disclosure, full insight to Feisty land over here. I moved into a new office. We downsized our office because we used to have a full-time staff of 4. And now we're down to just me here in Victoria. Everyone else moved away. And so I moved into a smaller office and it's quieter back here. For those who are regular listeners, I don't think we're going to hear any more seagulls, which I will miss a little bit on the podcast. But I've been here a couple days and I do have a rather loud neighbor who is talking loudly on a call right now. So just saying, there are thin walls. And so if you hear someone else talking in the background, that is what is happening. Anyway, as I said, I just hung up from today's interview and wow, what a great conversation. I talked to MacKenzie, who is a journalist and former senior editor at Glamour magazine. Macaela covers women's equality through the lens of sports and wellness and also the gender gap across industries. Let me tell you, Macaela is my people. Her and I caught up because her newest book, Money, Power, Respect: How Women's Sports Are Shaping the Future of Feminism, is coming out on June 27th. So I spent most of the day yesterday reading it, and oh man, it was so awesome. Macaela's writing is well-researched and highly academic, but also as readable as writing can be, with stories woven in about the biggest change makers in women's sports, all of whom she's interviewed, from Billie Jean King to Megan Rapinoe. Women's stories of athleticism and advocacy are woven into every chapter. Macaela and I talked about whether sports are really the quote-unquote last bastion of the patriarchy, how to respond to people who tell us that women's sports are boring, will never get viewer numbers, or that women are physically somehow less capable than men. We also talk about the business of sports and why women's sports are the best investment right now. Before we get started, I also want to mention that Inside Tracker added hormone markers to their testing. So for the science geeks, those tests are estradiol, progesterone, and TSH levels that are all now tested as part of their program. And these are all biomarkers that are meaningful when it comes to women's health. We used to have to wait for months and jump through hoops of fire to get our doctors to prescribe these kinds of tests. And now we can simply order them at insidetracker.com go to insidetracker.com/feisty and you get 20% off. So this is a great episode, but also make sure you get your hands on Macaela's book. Hi, Macaela. So excited to talk to you today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I got your book and I was reading your bio and it says that you're a journalist that writes about women and power, which is very intriguing to me. I love this. Like, how long have you had that as your kind of like your own personal byline?
Yes, very good question. So that kind of just developed with this book. So I've been writing about women's equality in various forms for years. And it was kind of throughout the reporting of this book over the last couple of years that I really came to understand and appreciate that power is always kind of at the center of these conversations, whether you're talking about equal pay or access to healthcare, like it always comes down to this conversation about power. Who controls it, who has it, who's trying to keep the status quo in place to keep it. And so, yeah, that just sort of became evident to me that that's the thing that I'm interested in, is looking at women's relationship to power and how we can change that and how it's evolving.
Yeah, I my PhD was actually in women's history, so I kind of took like the same lens on ancient history, because when you're coming from a feminist lens, there's always that power dynamic and analyzing and deconstructing it. Did you have a moment like as a child when you realized, or as a child or a young person, where you were like, wait a second, there's a ton of gender inequity in our world?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think, looking back on it, I don't think there was so much like one moment or specific instance where I was like, hang on, this isn't right. And more so just like the cumulative experience of being a woman. Like, I think bias and misogyny is so in the water that the older you get, the more water you swim in and the more obvious it becomes to you. So I think I was pretty lucky to have parents who, were always great about being like, girls can do anything, you can do anything you put your mind to, which is awesome. But I think, that doesn't always acknowledge the fact that the systems that we live in are not structured equally and fairly. And that can be really insidious, right? Like it's all these suggestions of like, oh, maybe you should take an English class instead of a math class because girls are better at English. And maybe you should sign up for the dance class instead of the soccer team because girls are better at that. And then certainly, becoming a young professional in the working world and maybe not being taken as seriously and starting to understand firsthand what the pay gap looks like. Yeah, I think it just sort of crystallized for me over time that this is something that impacts every facet of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting because I think for me, I was always told as a child, like, you can do anything,
Yeah.
and then I would look around and be like, yeah, but my chances of becoming prime minister, I'm Canadian, chance of becoming prime minister, pretty low, chances of becoming a pro athlete, pretty low.
Pretty low.
like this is real observation of the world, right?
I know, it's like it comes from a good place. Like it sounds awesome in theory, but then it's like, we also have to have those conversations about what the reality looks like and, how we can fight that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how you approach it in the book, like doing all the interviews with, women who have been sort of fighting for equality. Are you an athlete yourself?
It's funny when you do what I do and have the privilege of getting to speak to people like Simone Biles and Alex Morgan. I'm like, I can't call myself an athlete. Like,
right.
I'm not at all in the same world that they are. But no, I grew up as a competitive dancer. And then in college, I took up running. And I think that's when I first really started to identify as an athlete and kind of experience firsthand the power of sports. Being a runner, it was something I like never thought I could do. I thought I would be bad at it. I thought I would hate it. And it really ended up becoming this space where it was, where I was able to challenge assumptions that I had about myself. And I love it. I'm so happy to be able to do it. I started volunteering when I was a young graduate with Girls on the Run, which is this amazing nonprofit organization that teaches girls in elementary and middle school empowerment and confidence through literally training for a 5K. And I think that was like, yep, this is the thing. Like it really can teach you about what you're capable of. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, for sure. That's, when I first started reading your book yesterday, I was like, I kept writing down quotes and I got to like page 9 and I was like, I am never going to get through this if I don't just like stop and start just reading a little bit faster, Yeah. And some of the quotes were yours, and then there was this one from Mary Jo Kane, who we've talked to
through Feisty, I think, or maybe it was her colleague Nicole Lavoie.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, we I love, what's the research center called again that they
The Tucker Center for Girls and Women in Sport. Yeah.
yeah, amazing. And Mary Jo Kane said sports provide an arena that can completely destabilize our notions of women's physical, mental, and emotional competence. And so I actually, it was the head of a women's studies department who one time said to me that like sports are like the last bastion of the patriarchy, which I kind of kept with me because I was like, is it not? Like, do you think that that's true? And do you think that, like, to Mary Jane Joe Kane's point, like that the change making through sport can be bigger than in other areas?
Yeah. Yeah, Mary Jo is so fantastic. I mean, her work is so foundational in this space, and she's done so much specifically on like perceptions of women in sport. And so, yeah, I mean, she added so much insight to the book, and this is such a gem. But yeah, I do agree. I do think that sports really are kind of the last bastion of the patriarchy. If not the last bastion, then I think they're certainly a stronghold. Because, you know, when I started covering women's sports, when I was a senior editor at Glamour, you know, what really kind of turned me on to this idea that eventually became the book was that sports, you know, they don't just reflect our cultural attitudes, but I think they really help shape them. You know, it's this literal arena where we get to see women accomplish things. And we also get a lot of really overt messages about the way that we value women, or more accurately, don't value women. So I thought, you know, this is such an interesting sort of fertile ground to explore how we can change those stereotypes. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really the core thesis of the book, is that sports kind of has this outsized influence in shaping our perceptions of women and women's value, in a way that, you know, we just don't see in other industries. Like most industries don't have a reach like Serena Williams or Simone Biles. So I think this is a really, really important space to be paying attention to, for anybody who, you know, wants to promote and encourage women's equality.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it has this layered effect, right? And you mentioned it in the book. So this isn't an original Sara thought, but like that it's like when we're talking about change making, or often when we talk about like feminism, we're talking sometimes about like how the world needs to change, how we need to change policies, institutions, etc., or how we empower ourselves as women, you know. And it feels like sport kind of has both of those things, right? Like, so it can change the perception of what women are capable of, and also like internally change our perception of what we're capable of. Do you see that in some of the women that you talk to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was evident in pretty much every conversation I had for the book. The personal power of sports, I think, really can't be overstated. Like, it is this training ground. I mean, there's a reason why we see such a high correlation between, you know, C-suite women and women who played sports. It's like 94% of all women in the C-suite in the US played sports in high school and college.
Huge.
Yeah, I mean, that's no coincidence, right? Like, sports is just this, you know, incredible space where you get to learn grit and resilience, and having that space be not only available to women, but a space where women are encouraged to be and celebrated, is so important for being able to close these gender gaps, you know, later in life and in every industry. So yeah, I mean, I think that personal power is huge.
Yeah, of all the women you've talked to so many like pro athletes and change makers in this space. Like, who influenced your thinking the most?
Oh man, that's a big question.
Sorry, that wasn't on the question. The questions I sent ahead of time, I just threw that one out.
Like picking a favorite child. I mean, I have to say Billie Jean King. Like, she obviously just the absolute godmother of the movement. What she has done for women's equality, you know, beyond sports, I think is just, yeah, I feel so lucky to be able to have talked to her and learn from her. But the thing that really struck me the most about her thinking and her conversations and everything that she has done in her, 50 plus years of activism, is that she really understands that this is about culture change. It's not just about changing a law or, changing the pay of one tournament or one sport or one company. If you don't have real deep culture change about, the worth of one gender versus another, then you're never going to see lasting progress. For example, like equal pay or pay discrimination is illegal in most of the world. Like it's been illegal in the United States since 1963, and yet it still happens every day. So it's not enough to pass a law. It's not enough just to, give a soccer team equal pay. Like we have to have real deep cultural change.
Yeah, and that sort of plays out in sports too with Title IX, right? Like we have Title IX, it's been in place since 1972, but do we have a single college or university that's in compliance? I'm not sure, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think, and that's another place that I think sports can be so powerful, because I think they are really effective at driving that culture change. I mean, you can't look at, the women of the U.S. women's national soccer team, for example. You can't look at them and see everything that they've done and they've accomplished and think like women aren't capable,
Right.
So I think it's just, we get all of these amazing case studies in sports that are kind of hard to deny.
I love that. Your book is full of case studies, like I love how you weave together what's clearly like deeply academic work with just stories of the athletes and the change makers too. As you were writing the book, did you find that there are some sports that are more gender equal than others?
Good question. I think that I don't think there's any sport where we can say like, great job, our work here is done, we can move on. Like I think every sport still has a lot of progress that needs to be made. I think about the fight for equal pay in soccer, for example, because that has gotten so much media coverage. And first of all, it's like, yes, the women's team in the US got equal pay, but the women's team in Canada isn't there yet. Like you can look at it, sort of by region, but even, when we did get this huge historic contract in the US, the players will tell you like the work is just beginning. Like just because they have a contract that guarantees them equal pay now, that does not mean that the sport is equal in terms of that deeper cultural change. But I do think that there are certain sports that are certainly better than others in terms of gender equality. Like, you look at tennis, it's no coincidence that the highest paid women athletes are overwhelmingly tennis players. And that is because that work has been happening for over 50 years, thanks to Billie Jean King and the original nine, in founding what became the Women's Tennis Association and making sure, that they were fighting for equal pay 50 years ago. So I think that some sports are better than others. I think there's some really exciting things happening in women's basketball right now in terms of investments being made, and sort of like excitement and buy-in from the stakeholders in the league, to make more investments in the game, to bring women's basketball to parity with men's basketball, but there's still a massive pay gap there. So it kind of depends on what metric you're looking at.
Yeah. And I think to your point, like the culture change has to happen simultaneously in order for people to watch women's basketball, for example, or value that enough to buy the ticket and go, which people are increasingly, thankfully, because it's amazing sport. But yeah, I came from triathlon, and sometimes some of these newer sports like triathlon or CrossFit, like they've avoided a little bit of like the hanging on of the old way of doing sports that comes with like a tennis or a soccer or some of the more golf, right? But still, like you can't separate it from the culture. Like someone once tried to tell me that equestrian, because the men compete against the women, was like completely gender equal, because everyone's competing. And I'm like, well, yeah, except that do you live like in a bubble? somewhere else in a different culture where, like there still has to be all of those baked in social biases, right?
Right.
Somewhere.
I think like mixed gender competition, to your point, like that is a really interesting arena. I think, we're starting to see that more in these individual sports, even like a lot of Olympic sports, like, ski teams training together, men and women. I think that is going to have huge ripple effects for gender equality in sport more broadly. But yeah, it's still, it's sort of like, are you asking a big enough question? Like you can look at this one competition and say, oh, look, they train together, so therefore it must be equal. But it's like, what's the broader system of support or lack of support behind these athletes?
Yeah, for sure.
Endurance sports should be accessible to everyone, right? That's why we are so excited to be partnering with Motive. Motive is one of the fastest growing training apps in the world today, with thousands of amateur athletes signing up every month and a nearly perfect 4.9 star rating in the App Store. You are not a template, and your training plan should not be either. Prepare for running races, triathlons, cycling events, duathlons, or swim runs, however your season schedule shapes up, and get training written by some of the best coaches in the world in each discipline who know what it takes to help amateur athletes reach their goal on race day. The app takes the training written by those experts and then creates the most optimal training plan for your schedule, abilities, and goals. Plus, the training is fully customized to your race schedule, how much you can train each week, your current abilities, and the goals you want to achieve in your race. You can use the app for free as long as you want, or get all the upgraded features from the app for just $19.99 a month. But as a Feisty listener, you can sign up at mymotive.com and use the code Feisty for 2 months of full premium access. That's right, you get 2 months of premium for free. So you quite literally have nothing to lose. So head over to mymotive.com, mymotiv.com, and use the code Feisty, Feisty. And on a personal note, I know the founder of Motive, and he is driven to make triathlon and all endurance sports more accessible for the athletes who care about their performance but who aren't quite ready for a full-time personal coach. If that sounds like you, definitely try the app for 2 months for free. You literally have nothing to lose. As a lifelong runner and triathlete turned CrossFitter, I am stoked to announce that the athletic eyewear brand Tifosi Optics has joined us as a partner here at Feisty Media. Tifosi sports glasses hit all the marks for athletes. They're shatterproof polybicarbonate, so the lenses not only reduce glare, but also offer scratch resistance, which I 100% need. They stay in place when you are moving. The hydrophilic rubber nose pads actually get more grippy the more you sweat, so they are secure and don't slide down your face even when you're running in hot conditions. No matter what sport you do, Tifosi has shades for you. Whether you love tennis, fishing, pickleball, running, cycling, or just hanging out on the beach. They are super reasonably priced, which I love, so I can have multiple pairs that go with any outfit. And of course, Feisty listeners get a special discount. So head on over to tifosioptics.com and use the code FM20. FM as in Feisty Media to get 20% off your order. That's FM20 at tifosioptics.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to make it easy for you. For decades, running shoes have been researched, tested, and designed for men. Brands have relied on the shrink it and pink it approach to sell male shoes to female customers. That's why we are so excited to be working with Heddas. Heddas designs athletic footwear for women that elevates performance, safety, and style. HEDAS unlocks the science behind women's biomechanics through dedicated research, creates better shoes for women that support their longevity and performance, and establishes new design standards to promote transparency in a male-biased industry. HEDAS have a lower ankle collar to reduce rubbing, a breathable mesh toe box to allow for ventilation and to allow for female toe shape, a special kind of plate in the midsole to keep tired legs going, a narrow heel cup to reduce heel slippage and take the pressure off our Achilles, and a rounded instep to create a snug fit. HEDAS has 3 shoe models designed for different sessions: the Alma Cruise for long runs, the Alma Tempo for training days, and the Alma Speed for pushing the pace. I've personally been running in the Alma Cruise and I love them. It's the shoe I always wanted and never knew I needed. The fit is perfect in every way. You can get your own pair of HEDAS at hedas.com and use the code feisty20 for 20% off. That's feisty20 at hedas.com, and it will all be in the show notes.
Okay, so this is something people ask us a lot. And so I want to ask you, I want to pass on this to you. But we get trolls on our Instagram, right? Or people have their cousins and friends and husbands making comments or in the pub, and the 2 main arguments sort of against quote unquote women's sports having equal pay or equal airtime is that it's supposed that women are supposedly biologically inferior, right? And that no one will watch them because it's boring and the viewership numbers aren't there, and so we shouldn't get paid, right? So what are the arguments that you would make against those terrible arguments, in my opinion? But what would you say to those people at the pub?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's such a good question, because I get the same question all the time too. Mm-hmm. I'll talk about viewership first, because I think this is sort of the most palatable of the arguments against equal pay. Even people who would identify as feminists might be like, well, hang on, wait, yeah, the women's team doesn't generate as much money and they don't have as many viewers, so they shouldn't or couldn't be paid equally. Mm-hmm. I get how that line of thinking exists. It's a valid question to ask. But it's not asking a big enough question. Take basketball in the United States, for example. The NBA was founded over 75 years ago. So they've had nearly a century's worth of investment in that as an entertainment product, not just a sport, that they're now benefiting from. Whereas the WNBA was founded just over 25 years ago. So, the men's sport gets a 50-year head start. With all of the investments, with all of the, cultural significance that carries. And then, the women's game is expected to live up to the same viewership standard. So it's an apples to oranges comparison. I think when we do see the product treated more equally, for example, in tennis, you can look at the US Open, and the women's final and the men's final receives pretty similar hype, pretty similar media coverage, not exact parity, but it's pretty good. And we do see the women's final actually pull in more viewers than the men's final. In 2021, the final was between Leila Fernandez and Emma Raducanu, and they actually had a higher viewership than the men's final, which was Djokovic going for his 21st Grand Slam historic record-breaking titles. Wow. Mm-hmm. It's when you actually treat each property similarly from an entertainment perspective, you do see those viewership numbers. When it comes to the biological inferiority argument, that's a tough one not to get just infuriated by. Because but, I think 2 things are really important to understand there. First of all, it's not appropriate to say that all men are stronger and faster than all women, because, Justin Bieber is never going to beat Allison Felix in a race. That's just not going to happen.
Right. Great examples.
Yeah. But obviously, that's not going to be his strength and skill set. So I think it's just sort of dangerous and lazy to make the argument that all men are going to be bigger and faster than all women. But I think the more important thing to understand and the more interesting conversation to have, and this is something that Mary Jo Kane talks, really eloquently about, is how do we define athletic superiority? Do we define athletic superiority as, who can lift the most weight, or do we define athletic superiority as who can do a backflip on a balance beam? Both of those things obviously require a lot of athletic skill. Certain types of physiques are going to be better tailored to one versus the other. One is not better than the other. One does not make you a better athlete than the other. So I think, the way that we frame, biological superiority is just, very gendered. And even, when you look at sort of a head-to-head comparison, like there's this great example in the book, this story that I really loved while I was reporting of, Usain Bolt saying that he can't run. I think it was the 200 meters. He can't run it. He's really slow. And in fact, when you look at like the, women's championship, he would come in like 1,000th place. His best time in that race, there's like 1,000 women who were faster than him. And so that's even like, he's a runner, they're runners. It's just, that's not his race. Right.
Right.
So I think there's just so much room for interpretation in the way that we define athletic skill. And it's just, it's really sort of lazy and dangerous to say like, oh, well, I'm going to define athletic skill only in the ways that like suit a very specific type of man under a very specific set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And it's like, it's interesting. You talked about tennis earlier, right? Like tennis, not only has it had time and investment to build so that the women's game is valued equally by media and sponsorship and stuff like that, but also it's had time to develop its own game.
Yeah.
Right. That looks like different than the men's game. And I was actually talking to someone about this yesterday in basketball, because we have the WNBA, like kind of, I don't know how many years behind tennis, quick math, but like, now we see the women's game starting that evolution. Right. And I think that like we need to allow for that too, because they can develop into their own thing in and of themselves. Like the two games don't have to be, and they can both be like, sometimes to some people, the women's game is more interesting, right? Or better to watch, right? Depending on like sport to sport, person to person. So
yeah, exactly. And I think, sports are so interesting because they are, there's like the pure athletic competition piece of it. And then there's also the sort of entertainment enterprise piece of it. Right. Mm-hmm. And like, when you think about sports as entertainment products that aren't necessarily tied to, who's demonstrating the biggest dunk or whatever it is, then I think the conversation gets a lot more interesting, because there's all of this data that supports the idea that women athletes have built more engaged fan bases. It's like, it all depends on kind of like, how are you measuring success here?
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. We were, I said before the show that we covered Feisty covered a basketball game for the first time, last weekend. And so we had, like, I have a sports reporter, so she knows about basketball, but for us, the rest of us, it was all new, but it was interesting because we had the woman who's like the first Canadian that ever dunked, apparently. She was like kind of resistant to the question about it. Like, and it was very interesting to watch, like, oh, right. So first of all, she was resistant because she's like, well, I don't know if I'm the first, I'm just like the first person that we know that dunked. Right. Like, and then secondly, she was like, the women's game is just different. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not dependent on dunking. Right.
And I think that's sort of the really interesting thing that's happening in women's sports is like, this isn't just about succeeding under these terms that have been defined by men's sports. It's about building an entirely new system.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That's so good. And I think, back to the viewership numbers too, like I was thinking about, and I want to understand this more, and I want my audience to understand this more too, that like, there's a difference between in business, between profit and investment, right? And that a lot of people, I've found this as I've been building a business, a lot of people just don't understand business at all. They just hear a really big number, like that's $1 billion industry or whatever. And then it's like, oh, they think there's like $1 billion sitting somewhere in a bank, like related to that thing, that just like, that's just not how it works. Right. And like, I think, and you made this point earlier when we were talking about viewership numbers, that like we really need to be looking at like the investment piece, like until there's been more investment in women's game, right? Like how much do you know these types of numbers? Like how much more investment has there been, for example, like in men's basketball than women's basketball?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but yeah, it's billions for sure. I mean, you can look at, even what's happening in the NCAA with basketball, and it's like, you can actually put a number on what, the potential profits that an organization is missing out on by not investing. And, we saw this with March Madness in 2020, this huge debacle, for those who aren't familiar, where photos of the weight room in the women's tournament bubble were shared, compared to the weight room in the men's tournament bubble, which is like this state-of-the-art gym that has every single piece of equipment you could ever dream of, in this hotel ballroom, like sprawling and expansive. And then the women's, quote, workout facility is literally one rack of dumbbells that you could have bought on Amazon for like $400 and a pile of yoga mats. And that's like, go be a world-class athlete with this, and anyway, this, sort of spurred this larger investigation into the NCAA and the way that they were investing in the men's product versus the women's product. And it's not just the weight room, it's the quality of the accommodations. It was the type of COVID tests that each team had. It was the food that was available. It was even like, this was one of my favorite details I learned while reporting. It was down to the actual puzzles that came in the sort of swag bags for the people in the bubbles. Like, this is COVID, so they're all in quarantine, and they were given these swag bags with, gear and games and stuff. And the men's bubble got like 400-piece puzzles, and the women's players got like 150-piece puzzles. And it's just like, even down to like this tiny detail, they're still getting inferior products. So
wow, like the women can't handle the extra puzzle pieces.
Yeah, right.
It's just mind-boggling for them.
Exactly.
Like, what?
Which is just like, you wonder, like, one could assume that whoever made this bulk order of puzzles, like, why don't you just get the same one? But, I think those are just some kind of funny examples of how this like very insidious thing plays out. But yeah, it spurred this independent investigation of, how the NCAA was treating its men's teams versus women's teams. And they found that their lack of investment in women's basketball as a product, they were leaving up to $100 million on the table just by, not investing in this product that they already
had. From a business perspective.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's not even like, sorry, women's sports are just this, money loser. It's that you're not investing and you're leaving money on the table. So I think, we're starting to see a lot of work around, people building the business case around women's sports, and it's really compelling.
Yeah. Imagine the billions that are currently in men's sports also being put into women's sports, and how much that would grow based on, like, even already, like, women's sports are already at an inflection point, right? Like, it's growing kind of exponentially, it feels like, the last couple of years.
Which is interesting. Like, when you do think about it from a business and investment perspective, like, men's sports are a pretty saturated market, it's kind of, we're seeing, like, in the US, there's like 2 indoor football arenas that are being started. It's like, we already have like a men's major league football league. But women's sports are like, the equivalent of investing in a startup. Like, there's so much room for growth and expansion, and therefore so much room for return, that I think, ignoring that is just really almost criminal,
Yeah. And with an actual startup, like with a funded, say, tech startup, right, your chances of success are like 1 in 10 or less. But I feel like with women's sports, the odds, I don't know, this is just me saying this now because I want it to be, but the odds have to be better than that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, well, it's proven, like you do see all of these really exciting case studies of when you do invest, like you do see the returns. So I think the more of those case studies we get, the more change we're going to see.
When did you start writing the book?
Oh,
when did you start working on research?
Good question. I started, so the journey for me kind of started back in 2019. I was covering the U.S. women's national team on the road to the World Cup. So that's when I started doing a lot of research into the history of that team and the history of women's soccer. I read this fantastic book by Gemma Clark, who's a soccer historian. It's called Soccer Women. And she does such an amazing job of really detailing how the centuries-long fight for equality in soccer. Whereas, it had kind of landed on my radar as this contemporary thing that started, I think it was 2016 when they filed their first complaining for pay discrimination. And, she talks about how, back in England during World War I, these women's soccer leagues started as a way to raise money for the war effort in England, and they got too popular. And so the governing body of soccer in England literally banned women from playing soccer until 1970, because they were threatened by this idea that women's games were drawing too big of a crowd.
Wow.
And that's until 1970, which is so just mind-blowing to me. So that's when I really started to understand, like, this is so much bigger than, this one team and this one fight for equal pay. It's really kind of this integral part of the fight for women's equality over the past century. And I hadn't really heard it talked about that way. So it was something that I wanted to explore more and kind of bring to a new audience who maybe wasn't super engaged with the sports world, but does care a lot about gender equality.
Yeah, and part of the reason I asked about the when is that, like, you must have seen, even from when you first started to kind of unpack this intersection between feminism and sports, like then, like 2019 until now, you must have seen a massive change in, like, even viewership, sponsorship dollars. Is that true, or is that just my perception?
Well, that's absolutely true. And I mean, that was something that, it was one of the most exciting things for me as a person who cares about this. It was, made the process of writing the book kind of like, it just felt like it was never finished, because there was always something new developing, which is really great. But, even just to stick with the soccer example, when I went into writing this book and, was working on the proposal, I was like, they're going to get equal pay before this comes out. At least that's my hope. And so I never wanted it just to feel like it was about one specific team or one specific fight. And, obviously they did get equal pay last year, which is amazing. But I wanted it to be clear that, it's not, the work is bigger than that, and it continues.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we head into summer, rest and recovery are critical for improving sports performance, reducing stress, and living a long and healthy life. We should all invest in better sleep. So, think about the thing you lay your head on for 8 hours a night. If it's not exactly right for you, it can lead to needless tossing and turning, or worse, have you waking up with an unrelenting kink in your neck. My new Lagoon pillow has helped me improve my sleep immensely by pairing me with the performance pillow that has everything I need. So I personally was matched with the Otter pillow. Shout out to Team Otter, which I love because it has a gentle cooling effect. And I was able to choose how much stuffing I wanted in it, which is super important to me because I'm doing a decent amount of CrossFit these days and my shoulders are kind of creaky. So having a pillow that is stuffed just to the right height keeps my neck and head in exactly the right position and comfortable for the entire night. And as of fall 2023, Lagoon launched their 100% mulberry silk pillowcases. It's cool to the touch, buttery soft, and great for your skin and hair. You've got to go check out this pillowcase if you want to feel great and look great every morning. Waking up for morning workouts has never felt better. I'm refreshed and pain-free thanks to my Lagoon pillow. To check it out for yourself, go to lagoonsleep.com/performance and take the 2-minute sleep quiz to find your perfect pillow match. And then use the code PERFORMANCE for 15% off your first purchase. That's code PERFORMANCE at lagoonsleep.com/performance, whole 15% off, and the link is in the show notes. You can just click through there. Building muscle can be tough, and gains can be so slow, even for those of us who do a lot of strength training. As an ex-endurance athlete who is now in perimenopause, I know this all too well. It can be frustrating to put in the time in the gym and not see the results I'm looking for. That's why it's super important to take the right supplements at the right time. One of those supplements is essential amino acids, which are needed to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis happens when you eat high-quality protein, like eggs or whey. And by supplementing with additional essential amino acids, you can make sure you are getting the full benefit of your training sessions. Targeted essential amino acid formulas can be up to 4 times more effective than just eating protein. I've been taking amino acids for almost a year, and in combination with eating quality protein and a couple other supplements, I have managed to turn the tides on age-related muscle loss, which starts at 30 for women, by the way, and I have continued to make strength gains as I head towards 50. AminoCo has been a long-time sponsor of Feisty Media and has supported all of our brands and podcasts over the years. I recommend starting with AminoCo Perform, and you can grab some at aminoco.com/performance. If you enter the code PERFORMANCE, you will save 30% and receive a free gift if it is your first purchase. Give it a try and let me know how it goes. That's aminoco.com/performance and use the code PERFORMANCE to save 30%.
Okay, let's shift a little bit here. I really think this is interesting. And as like 2 white women sitting here talking about sports, and you mentioned it in the book. Can you explain what white feminism is and like some of the pitfalls that, we could fall into when we're trying to make change in sports?
Yeah. So everything I know about white feminism, I know from Koa Beck, who's this incredible journalist who really literally wrote the book White Feminism. Mm-hmm. And she chronicles how this way of thinking has really affected every major social movement, from suffrage in the 1900s and the right to vote all the way up until now. And how it's really marginalized women of color, trans women, disabled women, to the benefit of white women. So white feminism is essentially, aligning yourself with these ideals of white privilege and patriarchy in order to gain power within a system that ultimately is oppressing other marginalized groups. So, it's like working to become the CEO of a company that doesn't pay its workers fairly. Like that's not really feminism. Or, maybe put more simply, it's there's no equality for one without equality for all. So in sports, I think we're seeing this play out in some really interesting ways. Like the women of the WNBA are absolutely the gold standard of intersectional feminism, like the movements that they have built. They're so different, it's no coincidence that that's a league comprised of majority Black women. They really understand that idea that there's no equality for one without equality for all. And that is baked into everything that they do. So I think they should absolutely be the model for, social justice movements more broadly. I think they've accomplished so much, and often not gotten credit for it. That's something that I really wanted to emphasize in the book too. When we think about the fight for social justice within sports. Most people think of Colin Kaepernick first, and his work is absolutely incredibly important. But, the women of the WNBA were doing that work before he kneeled. And it's not to say that like one's more important than the other, but I think it's just like, you don't hear about the work that the women of the WNBA have done as often as you hear about, the fight for racial justice in men's sports. But I think another area where this is playing out, and I know this is controversial for a lot of people, but I think we're going to look at the fight for inclusion for trans women in sports, pretty similarly to the way that we can now look back, to the suffrage movement where women fought for the right of women to vote, but by women, they meant white women, and often actively worked to discourage and oppress Black women's votes. I think, in 100 years, we'll be looking back on sports and saying the fight for equality for women in sports, meaning only cisgender women, is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you there. And I know that it is like contentious even in the circles, where I've worked with groups of people who are advocating for change in our sport and triathlon. And I recognize like that same group. And I don't know what all of them think, honestly, but like there's definitely some division around like trans inclusion, and yeah, I don't really know. I'm not really a great person to talk to because I'm like so squarely on the inclusion side. Like, how do you define what a woman is for the purposes of sport?
Yeah.
How could you ever do that? And if someone identifies as a woman, like what else can you, how else can you decide? But I do know that there is a lot of conversation, particularly when there's like prize money involved and stuff like that. But I really resonated with how you wrote about that topic too in your book, because or the way you wrote really resonated with me, I should say, because it because of the kind of not to make it about whatever, but it's like the misogyny baked in to the conversation, which is like, if someone went through puberty as a male, there's no way that like a cisgendered woman could beat them. Like, what? Like, do you know how many guys like I beat in a triathlon? Like, it's thousands of people,
Exactly. Yeah. That to me really reveals that like this isn't about fairness and competition. This is about policing women's bodies, because all of these, bills that are being passed and thrown around about, trans participation in sports, they're always about women's sports. Like none of these bills are about trans men participating in sports. And I think that really says a lot. And then I think you also kind of, open this really slippery, go down this really slippery slope when you start talking about regulating people based on like their biological skills, because that's what makes sports exciting. Like Michael Phelps has biological advantages that make him a better athlete than all of the guys he's swimming against, and we praise him for that. That's what makes him such a fantastic, legendary athlete. So how can you say like, well, some people we're going to police for their biological, skills and assets, and others we're going to champion for it. I think that kind of goes against the ethos of what makes sports exciting. And then obviously is really, really dangerous to a group of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And the question of like how you police, like how you actually enforce that policing.
Yeah.
Right. Like we see, I think it's in Florida, where it's like the gender checks include genital inspection, where you see bills starting to come through like this. It's like, what are we going back 50 years? It's like the nude parade in the Olympics, right? Like, why are we here? Like, how does that protect kids when your girl can be like called somewhere to her genitals checked because she looks too masculine? Like, what is that? What even is that?
So it's so easy to imagine that happening, right? Like some girl has an issue with another girl in middle school, like she's getting bullied, and she like lodges this, false complaint that she should have to go through this type of check to compete on her team. Like, there's just no way that you can tell me that a law that would allow for a government to perform genital inspections on girls is a law that supports women's equality. And I think that is the thing that just blows my mind, when we do see advocates for, equality in sports, holding up these laws and trying to prevent women from being able to compete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, you spent a whole chapter on individuals who are change makers. And I'd love to know, like, what are the common traits that you saw in some of those individuals?
Yeah. The number one thing that came through in all of those conversations is understanding that their fight is bigger than they are. I think that to me was like the really beautiful thing about, getting to talk to so many women athletes is that there's this very clear, tangible understanding that what they're doing is bigger than them. It's bigger than their sport. It's bigger than all sports. And I think they really operate kind of with that North Star in mind. I think we see male athletes, they aren't held to that standard. Like they get to show up and just be good at their job and get paid millions of dollars to do it, and not also have to be role models and advocates and, change makers in society. Women athletes do have to do that because that's the way that the system is set up. So I think it's having that understanding that what they're doing is always bigger than them and kind of trying to open the door for the women behind them. And also the understanding that we are stronger as a collective. In sports, we get so many examples of collective movements that, are kind of more fun and exciting and visible than, sort of like the conversations about unions and labor organization that are so important and has driven so much social change. But, maybe the average person like doesn't think that's super sexy. But when you see women in sports organizing, I think it's a lot more galvanizing. And so, that understanding among them that they're always going to be stronger working together. Like we see a lot of collaboration across sports. Women in soccer are talking to women in hockey who are talking to women in the WNBA. And they're going to be better for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And how do we get more media coverage for women's sports? Like, how does that happen? I know that's a huge question. It's layered. Like, give us the Cole's notes of that.
Number one, watch women's sports. That's a question I get a lot of, like, oh, like, what can I do? Like, watch them, put them on, like, just throw it on your phone, stream it. That matters. Buy season tickets to a local women's sports team, like show your support in that way. Like, unfortunately, because women's sports aren't valued well, like they're usually pretty cheap. That's like a pretty easy thing that you can do to support and kind of help make that business case. And I think also engaging with women athletes on social media. I think we're going to see a huge sea change thanks to the NIL laws that are allowing college athletes to profit off of their name, image, likeness, because it's cutting out the middleman. Like it's allowing these athletes to actually capitalize on the fandom that they build in a way where, they don't have to deal with a league telling them what they're worth. They can actually say, like, here's my audience, here's how engaged they are. And because of influencer culture, like we have some pretty direct metrics about what that's worth. So I think, getting more media coverage of women's sports starts with people, sort of voting with their dollars and with their follows, and showing that this is a product that they want more of.
Yeah, I love that. I love it's like beyond, because watch women's sports. That's a thing that we hear a lot. Right?
Yeah.
And then, and honestly, I find myself more interested in sports that I was never interested in before because I can now watch women play them on the internet, right? Which is like, I can't be the only person in that boat. It's like, I don't really care about men's sports because I don't relate to that. It's boring.
Exactly.
But then like that next layer of like when people do start watching, when you have the influencers, we've created a social media influencer, then that person has the capacity to make more money. And then that woman, like there's more money in women's hands. And then then what are those people going to invest in? Well, there's going to be some percentage of it that comes back into women's sports, right? So it's like a giant flywheel that's in motion.
Yeah.
I heard something, and I'd love to know if you think this is true, like that in potentially as soon as like 20 years from now, that we could have more than 50% of the wealth in North America in women's hands. Do you see a path to that? 20 years seems short, right?
20 years seems short. Yeah. Depends on the day that you ask me that question. Feeling. I think it's entirely possible. I think the pace of change that we're seeing happen, even just in this one industry, is really encouraging. I think that the business case is there. It makes sense. The question is around like, are we going to see the culture change that allows that to happen? Like, there's a chapter in the book on leadership, and there's just like massive amounts of data on the fact that when we have more women in leadership positions, whether that's like in a CEO role or just a more diverse board and C-suite, companies make more money. Like we see more returns. And you would think,
really,
yeah. And you would think if that's the, your measure of success, like every company should just be putting a woman in the position of CEO. We should be having much more diverse boards from a racial and gender perspective. But despite all of the evidence that says you'll probably make more money if you do that, that's not really happening as fast as we'd like to see it. And I think that really speaks to this still like deeply embedded cultural misogyny. So yeah, I think it's absolutely possible that we could see more than 50% of the wealth in women's hands. But I think, that's going to require some really deep shifts in the way that we think about women's worth.
Yeah, I agree. I hope it's true.
I know. Yeah. Like we just need to, get this bias out of the way.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just get rid of that.
Yeah.
Easy peasy.
Yeah.
Okay, Macaela, how do people get their hands on the book?
Oh, yes. Well, it comes out on June 27th. You can order it from any major bookseller, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, as well as independent booksellers, which is always so awesome. I love to see people supporting local bookstores. So you can find it on bookshop.org.
Cool. And how do we follow you?
You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I'm at Macaela Mac. And also you can see all of my work and find more information about the book on my website, just MacKenzie.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a fun conversation, and appreciate you spending the time with me. Yeah.
My favorite thing to talk about. So it's made my day.